Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with G'RA ASIM, discussing his book, Boyz and the Void, a mixtape to my brother in conversation with Sabrina Alli. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved readers that we are able to make events like this happen. So thank you so much for continuing to show up for us week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We will get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copies of Boyz and the Void. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Thank you so much, Zoom, for increasing your accessibility. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself. Simply locate the button marked live transcript on your display and click through the options. And lastly, as you have probably experienced during virtual gatherings this last year, technical issues might come up. If any glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. And now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. G'RA ASIM is a writer, musician, and an assistant professor of nonfiction writing at Ithaca College. His writing has appeared in Slate, Salon, Guernica, The Baffler, and The New Republic. In addition to his prose, he also plays bass and writes lyrics for pop-punk band babygotbacktalk, who are named one of Afropunk's top 8 punkest bands on the planet right now, and one of Alternative Magazine's 17 rising Black alternative bands who are leading the next generation. Tonight, he is joined in conversation by Sabrina Alli, a writer, activist, and educator whose work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Guernica, The New Inquiry, and elsewhere. Writing on everything from prison abolition to the attempts to decolonize museum spaces, she's currently at work on a book about early 20th century labor organizing, border crossing, and mixed race romance in the United States. This evening, they'll be discussing G'RA's amazing book, Boyz and the Void, a mixtape to my brother, a work that the brilliant Kimberly Crenshaw calls a spellbinding odyssey and a magnificent debut for an exciting young author and thinker. Blending music and cultural criticism, as well as personal essay to explore race, gender, class, and sexuality as they pertain to punk and straight edge culture, Boyz and the Void vividly recalls chapter by riveting chapter some of the scene's most iconic hits and images in order to plumb the depths of that pressing and essential question, how does one be in the world? How does one be in the world specifically when you are young, Black, brainy, and weird? This book is a much needed guide and a tremendous gift, offering us a window into the free and frenetic world that G'RA inhabits, while also sharing with us the tenderness of a letter sent between brothers. We are so excited to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm now delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, G'RA and Sabrina.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Benjamin. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to Harvard Bookstore for having me and my rowdy friends, and particularly Sabrina, to hang out and talk about this book.
Yes.
To sort of set the tone this evening, I will begin with a reading from a chapter in the book called To the Edge and Back. It's an annotation of a song called Sick Transit Gloria, Glory Fades by Brand New. Give a little bit of context. That essay in the book is kind of where I'm like most overtly grappling with straight edge as a cultural movement, sort of, providing an origin story of why I got involved with it, and then what kinds of happenings in the world and in my life made me start to get pretty ambivalent about being involved with it, not just, straight edge in a vacuum, but particularly what it meant to be straight edge as a Black person, and the possible tacit endorsement of respectability and respectability politics that it might represent. So I think that's enough stage setting. Here goes. In the history of my unfortunate punk-inspired fashion choices, a black jean jacket on which I'd sloppily written straight edge XXX with one of those hokey glitter paint pens would probably be a candidate for the Hall of Shame. One good thing that came of it, however, was that an aging punk chef who worked at my food service job spotted my jacket hanging in the back of our restaurant. After connecting me with the garment, he made a ritual of repeating the following apocryphal story to me about his adventures as a militant straight edger. Lucas hovers in a shadowy alcove of a grocery store, stealthy and vigilant as an owl overlooking a placid meadow, mohawked hair streaming gallantly in the October wind like a subversive flag, leather jacket zipped high enough to conceal his unsmiling mouth. His image bears a striking resemblance to the shadowy figure depicted on those neighborhood watch signs that cluttered the poles of streetlights and abandoned buildings in urban areas. Looking at him, you feel compelled to superimpose the words, "We report all suspicious activities and persons to law enforcement," over his lithe torso. His scornful gaze is directed at the rear entrance of the store, where two employees, young and off the clock exultant, loiter with a coterie of friends of roughly high school age, their jocular speech and breezy laughter echoing down the empty alley. If you weren't watching as closely as Lucas, you might attribute the clouds of smoke that the jovial clique emits to the evening's frosty temperature, rather than the pack of cigarettes they're sharing. Lucas gathers himself to confront the unsuspecting organic grocery workers and their cronies, a keen prickling of imminent violence suffusing his tensed form. "Drop the smokes," Lucas bellows in a voice like rumble strip, streaking toward the night revelers at full tilt, an atom bomb carrying innumerous tons of explosive sanctimony. Relishing the ripple of trepidation that darts through the circle of smokers, he stretches out his gnarled, filthy hands, each crudely emblazoned with the trifecta of X's. "Give me the cigs or somebody's getting hospitalized tonight." "Hey, Edge," a hanger-on gasps, a muggle-born announcing the arrival of Lord Voldemort. Most of the crowd disperses with impressive speed, but a single gangly male remains. Chest outstretched, pack of Marlboros in hand, he shoves Lucas's protruding fists back in the direction of their owner. "Take them from me." Within a moment as brief as the interim between a drag and exhalation, the gangly boy has paid dearly for his hubris. Suddenly dazed and moaning at an unobstructed view of the mid-autumn constellations, he slowly raises his fingers to the blood, leaking copiously from his nose. Standing over him, Lucas leers, lobs a loogie at the humbled teenager's crumpled face. "It was a pleasure." The Marlboro slung satisfyingly into the back pocket of his ripped jeans, Lucas scoots off into the darkness to consult the grocery store's dumpster for dinner options. Homeless, unemployed, and shamelessly antisocial, the punk rock lifer would not be amenable to any suggestion that he is merely a parasite of the system. By the logic of his scarcely educated, undernourished, and half-shaven head, tonight's events represent a generous contribution to society. I traveled to Egypt during one of my last semesters of grad school. I was 30 years old, and it was my first time leaving the country. My host told me to expect to be identified as a tourist and targeted by beggars and merchants accordingly. When African Americans make their way to what's known as the motherland, the tropes invite us to view the experience as a homecoming. Instead, I felt more conscious of myself as a pampered dweller of the first world, traveling to the global south. The last thing I wanted to do was accidentally fall into any of the condescending postures that made my own society's most privileged members so insufferable. I'd sooner be a hapless mark for con artists than a haughty American. It was a relief to learn a hand gesture that meant no thank you. When panhandlers or street sellers approached me and made their pitches, my host instructed me to say le shukran while placing my right hand over my heart. If a stranger was calling to me from a distance and my voice couldn't be heard over the din of zooming traffic or the commotion of other pedestrians, just making the hand over heart gesture would communicate something like, yo, good looking out, but I'm good. A shorthand for respectful, even appreciative refusal was something that eluded me during my tenure as an American straight edge kid. In my life in the States, turning down a glass of wine, a line of Coke, a drag of a cigarette, a hit of the blunt, and offered to hook up was so often taken as an affront. I was not, or at least didn't aspire to be, the defiant do-gooder in one of those my anti-drug public service campaigns. Though matters of conscience inform my decision to abstain, I had no desire to make anyone else feel like their own decisions to partake were moral failures. I was trying to embody noncompliance that didn't indict those who complied. At parties, I declined favors as nonchalantly as possible, typically only invoking straight edge when, nah, I might, hadn't worked. The goal was practice without preaching. There was an irony to the idea that choosing to value my own autonomy was received primarily in terms of how it reflected on other people. I wanted to think for myself. It would undermine the sanctity of that project to deny other people the same right. I think of the body language I resorted to most often on the streets of Cairo as a summation of what straight edge meant to me. The right hand over my heart gesture symbolizes both the sincerity of my commitment to straight edge and a live and let live praxis of it. Punk is the first subculture I immersed myself in with the vivid awareness that it was in fact a subculture. It showed me that if the dominant culture was the main thoroughfare, there were likely to be all kinds of side streets and alcoves where none of the main thoroughfare's assumptions were taken as a given. So I'll stop it there. That's from To the Edge and Back. I like where that selection kind of empties us out to begin this conversation because in a way, Sabrina and I know each other because we were two people who sought out these side streets where none of the dominant culture's assumptions were taken as a given. Not so much through punk rock, although we have some overlap there, but because choosing to go to an unspeakably expensive MFA program in New York City is very much a decision to immerse oneself in a subculture and to sort of seek out like-minded folks who might be operating in various ways that are contrary to what's going on the main thoroughfare. So of the various benefits that seeking out subcultures has yielded for me personally, knowing Sabrina and others like her is one of the primary ones, one of the main blessings I count.
I feel the same about having met you at Columbia. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to do this and for reading that passage, which is a really interesting passage because it's such a juxtaposition where it begins with someone finger wagging and then you know, acknowledging that like, that's not how you roll is this sort of preachy mentality. So I really appreciated that. We are going to talk more about, you know, the relationship that you have to punk and that your writing has to punk. But I do want to open up with a question about what the void is in the title of your book, Boyz in the Void, if we can kind of start there and then, you know, branch out into how you navigate the void and how you speak to your brother about that as well.
Yeah, great question. I appreciate that as a way to kind of ground us. Well, I think one way to think about the purpose of the void as a metaphor might be to just kind of, you know, point out the path that led me there. You know, I started off trying to write this book from a much less personal angle. I had some observations about punk and straight edge culture that I kind of wanted to explore, and particularly their relationship to some of the legitimizing myths that hold the culture together, that hold the American way of life together, I guess. And I found that over the course of writing those essays and pursuing feedback from readers in the MFA context and in other contexts as well, people would often respond by telling me that I wasn't like, that the I character, not necessarily me, I guess, the I character in the essays was not really a point of view they could really imagine, that they found the voice and the sort of set of concerns to be implausible or hard to square with anything they were familiar with. And so after a few times of encountering that response, it brought me to this idea that we sort of all walk around with what I like to call like a IRL dramatis personae of what kinds of people we think exist in the world. And we come up with this dramatis personae, this sense of like, here's the cast of characters based on lived experience, on things we see in mass culture, and on stereotypes. And if you're a person whose personality or writerly persona doesn't seem to square with their social location, and I use that term to specifically mean the combination of sociological factors like race, class, sexuality, etc. If your personality and your social location are perceived to not go together, there's a good chance that you're absent from most people's kind of IRL dramatis personae. And so when I came to that idea, I realized that in order to really flesh out my relationship to punk and straight edge and to present myself as a plausible and engaging narrator, the book had to do two different kinds of work. It had to talk about the subculture and my participation in it, but also instantiate myself as a person that exists in the world, as a character that should exist in your IRL dramatis personae. And that's kind of what led me to writing the book to my brother. I'm kind of using my family, meaning my immediate kind of like nuclear family, as a way to world build. And the fact that I needed to do so much world building in what is a nonfiction book is sort of a function of the void, right? That absence, that sense that there's a map of what kinds of people exist in the world and what kinds of voices and concerns we should find believable. And there's lots of people who are not on that map for a combination of reasons. And for me, punk and straight edge are actually ways of coping with not being on that map. And then, ironically, writing this book has kind of allowed me to use punk and straight edge as a way to put myself and others like me, including my brother, including my nuclear family, on that map, to kind of like locate us on that dramatis personae.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You write a lot about these different spaces you're in where you are unrecognizable or you're misunderstood, and then how you choose to navigate each one is really interesting. And, your interest in punk is because of your rejection of the status quo, and also just not feeling like, there is space for you to belong in that normative, way of belonging. So I want to talk about, the impact that punk has, just not just on your personal life, but also on your writing, because we had talked a little bit about this. And my first reaction to your book is, I think it's really exuberant. Like, I think it's a very joyful read. Of course, it has serious political analysis, and it's not always, not every event is happy, but the actual style that that you put on the page is one that's like, it's like jubilant, like a punk song. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that, like that relationship, and also that you created that style. It's very original to you. I mean, it's very punk, but your style is so you. So if you could just kind of expound on that, that would be Nice. Could I actually read something that maybe too would give an example? And I mean, there's so many passages, but this is actually, this very short passage is your relationship to language. And it's a little bit out of context because it's in your idiolect chapter where you're talking specifically about code querying, but this I think is really brilliant and I think encapsulates that like punkness to me anyway. You write, as a person who intuitively approaches language like a great primeval jungle gym, I'm admittedly invested in words in a way that transcends their practical utility, a verbal style that shuffles demurely through social spaces in single file does nothing to heat the blood. I crave the vitality of a code that gallivants, that saunters indecorously, that swings exultantly from chandeliers. It's really fun.
Yeah, when we were talking about this before, Sabrina said, when I'm reading the sentences in this book, I feel like I'm hopping through a field. And it was a really exciting moment to have a reader have that response. What's it called? There's a Miranda July movie where she talks about like, there's like a genre of response you can have as an artist that she calls a macaroni moment. And it's just when like you feel the message has been very clearly received and the audience tells you in no uncertain terms, like, I got it. Like, I'm with you. I'm following I'm picking up what you're putting down. And the hopping through a field thing is like not something that I've consciously thought about before, but when you said it, I was like, yeah, that's the sensibility I'm trying to capture, but I'm not exactly sure if it's always coming through. So the weird thing about punk, and to some degree, I guess like kind of a strange thing about my personality is like punk has this really aloof, standoffish quality to it in some ways, right? It's not like intended to be welcoming in the most superficial sense. In fact, as a fashion style and as a musical style, some component of it is intended to be alienating, is intended to make you feel like the look or the sound isn't approachable. But sort of underneath that antisocial exterior, it has this really effervescent quality, right? Like even if you're listening to Black Flag, which is a band a lot of people think of as kind of like the quintessential tough guy hardcore band, and that's like a fair characterization. If you're actually listening to it or actually watching them perform, it might be a bunch of like shirtless dudes who live at the gym who were like bounding up and down while listening to it, but they are nonetheless bounding up and down, right? And there is this sense of release that is happening while the band is playing. So while a surface level reading of punk style and punk sound and you know what I'm aspiring to be a punk rock prose style might be that it is dour or confrontational. What I see as kind of core to the punk constitution is this sense of exuberance, of excitement, of like almost adolescent rambunctiousness that has somehow like survived past adolescence. And so, you know, that's like, I've always felt aware that when I sit down with a guitar and like try to write the first thing that comes to mind, what tends to come out is stuff that's really buoyant and excitable and high energy. And I wanted to somehow be true to that same aura in the prose. And that essay that you quoted from, Sabrina, I guess is almost like the moment in the book where I like confront that idea most explicitly, even though the code that I'm laying out that I would like to communicate in is hopefully also being demonstrated in all the other essays at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah, I'm also thinking about the scene when you're recording and the recording artist is like, wait, you can't use that language. it's too smart for a pop punk band, and just how again, you're navigating a space, you know, in this, and you're being told you're unrecognizable, yet you're choosing to like stay and reject that there is this particular way in which something needs to be done. And so I know that, you know, you're in a band and that you're also a songwriter. And so I'm assuming that, you know, and I know this from your music a little bit, is that, yeah, your songwriting does reflect the similar style of your writing, but just maybe if you could talk more about how your band, babygotbacktalk, is in relation to your project in this book, how you see them working together.
So the moment in American Idiolect, one of the essays in this book that you're mentioning, Sabrina, a funny thing about that is this past winter, my brother, Jossie, to whom the book is addressed, was asking me if I had any Christmas songs in my canon. And I don't remember why he was interested, but he like wanted me to bust out a Christmas song. And I was like, well, I've only ever written one Christmas song, and it was kind of, I'm not super proud of it. It has a lot of limitations. And it's the book, it's the song that we're recording in the scene that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And when I mentioned that to Jossie, he hadn't read the manuscript yet. He goes like, oh yeah, you know, one cool thing I remember about that song is that you managed to use the word Kakedish in the verse. Like, I just didn't, you know, I don't know. I don't remember the song overall that well. Maybe it's not so good. I can understand like why you're not into it anymore. But the fact that Kakedish was in the verse and it worked was really cool. And I thought it was so funny that he said that. I was like, wait till you read the book. There's like an exact scene showing this record producer, this like pretty famed record producer from the scene I was in when I was in my early 20s, like basically saying, stop the presses. One thing that absolutely cannot happen in this recording session is someone singing the word Kakedish on this track. So it, you know, one funny thing about the process of putting this book together is like a lot of the anecdotes or experiences that I thought I might need to relate to Jossie, or that he would be able to glean some insight from. He very often would sort of come to the same idea without knowing it. And that's like, I don't know, it just makes me think everyone should write books to their siblings or like other important people in their lives, because it'll illuminate components of the relationship that, like, you know, you sort of feel intuitively, but you rarely see like fully investigated in print.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but overall, so there is, you know, this correspondence between my band babygotbacktalk's discography and this book in ways that are kind of surprising to me, because it's not something I've always consciously thought about. But I guess one really clear-cut example is there's a chapter in Boyz called Ever Since I Was a Little Girl that is talking about the history of feminist interventions in punk rock. And of course, one of the themes in the book, and usually a theme in a lot of anti-racist conversation, is this issue of police brutality. And so in that chapter, I'm talking about how in punk, it's like pretty standard to be anti-establishment. It's standard to be sort of suspicious, if not outright disdainful of cops. But within that tradition, it's rare that feminism and anti-racism merge within punk rock. Obviously, we're kind of seeing an uptick in that right now. Some of you might have seen that like viral clip of the teenage or maybe middle school age punk band, the Linda Lindas. They have a song called Sexist Racist Boys. It's a perfect encapsulation of that feminist and anti-racist lens coming together in the punk space. But I would argue that until recently, that's sort of the exception that proves the rule. So to bring it back to babygotbacktalk, one of the things we took on in our latest album cycle is the Say Her Name movement, which is specifically a sort of, I don't want to say rejoinder to the mainstream anti-racist anti-police brutality movement, but it sort of like functions as a feminist corrective to that movement, right? It makes a point to foreground the names and politicize the stories of Black women, girls, and femmes who are casualties of racist state violence. And so one of the songs on our record is called When They Go Low, We Go 6 Feet Under, which of course is a reference to the Say Your Name movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. And even though in the song, I'm kind of speaking about that issue from my own perspective, and my particular sense of being a person who was kind of always in danger of being subsumed into a narrative that would justify my own extrajudicial murder, right? What we ended up deciding to do as a band was devote the video exclusively to representing the names and stories of women memorializing the Say Her Name movement, even though most people would probably listen to the song itself and consider police brutality as a social problem through an exclusively male lens. So the effect is it's like, you know, a punk band singing about police brutality, but the images are kind of representing this movement, summing it up, and pointing out the synergy between feminism and anti-racism, but also between punk's traditional oppositional stance to cops and punk's traditional relationship with feminism. So if you read the chapter Ever Since I Was a Little Girl, and then you watch this Baby Got Back Talk video, When They Go Low, We Go 6 Feet Under, you can sort of see all these different tensions playing out in real time. And you can also kind of see Baby Got Back Talk's potentially imperfect attempt to sort of resolve some of those dissonances in a way that's unifying and hopefully galvanizing for punks and non-punks alike.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do want to talk more about what the relationship between Black feminism and punk has been. But I also really want to emphasize how interestingly and how complicated you write about identity in this book. And one thing I really appreciated is that, you know, you describe your own experience, and through that you explain that there is no authentically way of being Black in this country. It's like there's no real, this person is Black because of XYZ, you know, and you reject these sort of prescriptive norms for Black identity, I think, in a really interesting and smart way. And I really appreciated it. But I also want to talk then about how your understanding of being Black in this country, which I don't want to give it away, but by rejecting all of these norms and these reductive racial categorizations, what you do is you end on this very wonderful, rich, cohesive way of explaining what your experience of being Black in this country is. So on the one hand, there's no one way to be Black, but on the other hand, there is this racial solidarity that a person has, and it's like you do it by, you know, it's great because I know you're not into ideologies, but what I really like is it's so interesting that you mentioned like respectability politics and your tension with it, which I get, but then you end on this description of being Black as this sort of, it's in a Black radical tradition, you know, it's a Black feminist, Black radical understanding of Blackness, which is not so much that one creates solidarity purely through skin color and, you know, these social constructions of race, but that one creates solidarity because you decide to build solidarity against the dominant power, and then you beautifully draw that in relationship to punks. So that was a lot, but I guess I just want you to talk a little bit then about how your understanding of race and racism had developed as you were writing the book, or maybe it didn't. Maybe you always knew that this is how you thought about race, but just how your ideas have either changed or what you think that opened up, what the book has opened up for you.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words about that distillation about identity that comes up at the end of the book. I appreciate you noticing. I think it's like a crescendo. I'm sort of hoping readers can recognize as like a really solid takeaway they can emerge with at the end. I always think about this Joe Strummer quote, Joe Strummer being the frontman of The Clash and a pretty successful and iconic punk rock solo artist in his own right. When he was asked to define punk, he said something like, punk rock means exemplary manners to your fellow human beings. And it's, to me, such a nutshell, right? Like, what would it mean to look at humanity in its entirety and actually carefully consider what it looks like to be pro-human, to side with humanity in whatever political or social formation we find ourselves in, to behave respectfully and in a way that is observant of other people's humanity, kind of regardless of the context. And I think stuff like that is always aspirational, I should say, right? When he says it's exemplary manners to your fellow human beings, like I've been a punk rocker for more than 20 years. I've had a lot of situations and experiences where other punks did not demonstrate exemplary manners to me. So,
right.
and you know, I've failed at doing that myself, right? We can always find ways to make the scene, and obviously, you know, by extension, the world, more hospitable to people, particularly across forms of social difference, than it was in the past. It's something I was talking about, this idea of asymptotic solidarity, right? If we recall from math class, an asymptote is a line that is approaching another line, but doesn't actually touch it, right? It's in a permanent pursuit. Asymptotic solidarity is sort of where I'm at with this idea that Joe Strummer's laying out, and also where I am with this idea in the Black radical tradition that you're talking about. Not that we always say we have perfectly embodied support and tolerance and, you know, sensitivity to, you know, every single minoritized group possible, which is sort of like a vogue thing people say nowadays. Like, instead of saying that, just saying that's our target, and what are the things we can do to demonstrate exemplary manners? What are the things we can do to get closer to perfectly executing a performance of those exemplary manners? So one of the concepts or like metaphors I return to in terms of trying to understand the perceived tensions between Blackness and punkness and sort of refashion them, not so much as tensions, but synergies, is this idea of contrapuntal melody, like two melodies that sound like they occupy a sort of oppositional space, but they actually work together. One enhances the sound, the tone value of the other. And so I posit in the book that, like, for me, Blackness and punkness have played out like contrapuntal melodies that, when heard together, form this resounding chorus. And I guess the reason I say that, I mean, obviously, there's lots to say on that subject. There's a whole book. But if I had to break it down, I would say the reason I'm making that case is because Blackness, as it was presented to me in my own household, right? The values in the sense of self-definition that my own parents offered me always kind of chimed with what Joe Strummer is talking about, right? You know, my mother, a phrase she used a whole lot with me when I was a kid was like what she called man's inhumanity to man. And she meant that in the most gender inclusive sense, that the source of so many social ills was people's baseline lack of compassion or lack of altruism in terms of how they regarded other people. And that was like a phrase she returned to a lot to kind of explain things to me that were really baffling to my like 7 or 8 year old mind. Like, oh, you know, how can so many people be hungry? How can they be poor? Like, how do these social problems just persist and are never addressed? And she would always say, well, you know, racism's a thing, sexism's a thing. And those are forces that are operational in my life, but more broadly speaking, it's this pattern of man's inhumanity to man. And part of our job as Black folks, as well-meaning folks, as social progressives, is to kind of disrupt that inhumanity and to embody some kind of alternative to it. So by the time I was old enough to encounter voices like Strummers or like the band Operation Ivy, who were kind of like a gateway punk band for me, or Ian MacKaye, who's a thinker who's also influenced me, even though those were touchstones of a culture that most people associated with white people, from a philosophical standpoint, I thought there was a lot of overlap between the kind of program they were selling and what my own parents had sort of raised me to believe, the lens that they gave me to look at the world and my place in it. And I don't think I'm the only one, right? So, you know, I guess like one of the big takeaways from Boys of the Void would probably be that the sort of surface level markers of a given cultural artifact might obscure the similarity or harmony between that artifact and Black experience. If you're just going to look at Operation Ivy and say like, oh, all the members of this band are white, therefore only white people would be interested in it or like see themselves reflected in it. Well, I mean, I can understand that reading, but it's you know, it's not true. It's so reductive that it actually does the art a disservice. And so I think overall, I'm kind of making the case that if we can identify how some of these philosophical linchpins of bands like Op Ivy and Minor Threat and The Clash might chime with teachings of the Black radical tradition, you actually realize how much cultural production is applicable to you and relevant to you and potentially resonant with you. And I was fortunate to kind of encounter that at an early age, and proceeding with that understanding has kind of shaped everything that's happened since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's what's nice about the book is that you seem more interested in drawing relationships and seeing how things cohere versus like drawing out polarizations. It's like looking at these seemingly like contradictory things or things that we make assumptions, binaries that we have in our head that maybe aren't, if we look, you know, if we examine a little closer, don't hold up. And I think, you know, and again, it's like you're writing about all these different things. You're certainly writing about punk and race, but your ability to sort of pull in these relationships. So definitely between punk and race, which, you know, we know, but also between, gosh, what was I thinking? It's in my notes. Give me a sec. Between, gosh, sorry, I'm having a brain fart. Oh, I know, we talked about this, between, you know, this sort of highbrow and lowbrow art, you know, and also between this sort of like, you know, any sort of anti-intellectualism and invisibility of a Black tradition. And then of course there's this very rich Black tradition that you also recognize you're working within. So I just thought that was really nice, is that you're not working on just these sort of creating these oppositional stances, even with gender, you know, it's like you're not constructing, you know, female in opposition to male, you know, when you write about your parents and your own understanding of gender. So I think that's really important. And I think that's important in the context of knowing how rich the book is, because it's not just a book, you know, in the tradition of this is a book about punk, and it's not just in the tradition of this is a book about how to be anti-racist, you know, it's like neither of those things, yet, you know, you're combining all these different elements and showing us closer, you know, how to think about them in coherence as opposed to in opposition. So
yeah, I'm always thinking about like the metaphor I come back to as an essayist, not just like in terms of like writing this metaphor, but a guiding principle I try to impart to my students as an essayist, and that sort of orients my own process, is this idea of constellating things, right? If you like look at the night sky, you get in this habit where you can be like, oh, there's Ursa Major, there's Ursa Minor, because someone showed you that if you connect all these stars, they make this shape. But in terms of like concepts in the world or texts that we're familiar with, we sometimes have to draw the through line for ourselves. And once we've done that, we can recognize that connecting these dots or aligning these stars produces these coherent crystalline images. And so I think that's sort of like the broad project of the book, right? That I see these clusters of stars as related, but maybe they're not recognized as constellations yet. And I'm just kind of drawing the line that turns this vast starry expanse into little tableaus, and then telling you what I think those tableaus mean.
Yeah. And I mean, and through that, you get to introduce so many different, so much different art. You know, again, it's like, certainly punk is very prevalent, and for punk aficionados, it'll be really fun to read because you do actually write about music that is significant to that world. But, you know, just the range of what you cover in this book, you know, from Little Richard to, you know, a Disney movie with Billy Joel to, you know, John Keats to, you know, it's like you don't have a filter for like how we should compartmentalize things, which I think is really nice. And so, yeah, you know, someone who is interested in, you know, literary theory will get just as much out of your book as someone who's maybe just like, I'm just down because I really like punk and, you know, I like memoir, you know? So yeah.
Well, I think one thing that has sort of a synergy that has emerged for me in the process of writing this book is the kind of overlap between putting together a mixtape and putting together a syllabus. And obviously, as an educator, you probably experienced those similarities yourself. But an argument I'm making to my brother, I think, is that this, what I call an ethic of discerning but miscellaneous accumulation, this like willingness to dive deep with that character in Oliver and Company that you mentioned, that's voiced by Billy Joel, and then an equal willingness to dive deep with something like Calvin and Hobbes, and then, you know, also the scholarship of the anthropologist Elizabeth Chin, that omnivorous sensibility, that willingness to kind of check out stuff that might not jibe with our established wheelhouse or that other people might see as disposable or like low culture, pays off, right? That doing that as a lifelong practice has benefits that have sustained me, right? Have given me like what Albert Murray calls aesthetic equipment for living. And if I wasn't doing that stuff, I'd be in a bad place. So I think the range of things I'm covering in the book and the way I'm trying to draw connections between them is not just for its own sake, but also to kind of support that argument of like, hey, Jossie, one way to sort of navigate this place, this mortal coil, is this, you know, discerning but miscellaneous accumulation. And if readers find the result of that rewarding, then hopefully my brother will be all the more likely to kind of find the same blueprint worth emulating.
So what does he think of the book? Have you guys talked about it? I mean, it's obviously come up in conversation.
Yeah, I mean, he read it pretty recently, so it's you know, it's an ongoing conversation. He, as I call him in the book, he's an artist in reticence, like reticence with a T. A man of few words, right? So it's not like he wrote me a letter in reply, but you know, it's been good. It's been positive for both of us, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously very clever, like you, creates words. You know, sounds like he's got an interesting, colorful imagination, just like you. So it's really, yeah, I mean, that's also part of the fun of this book too, is that you imagine these, you know, alternative spaces, you know. I told you already, I really liked the Mothership, how you described that space where you and your sister imagine that you kind of were just plopped down into this crazy world, but you have this ability to like be here among the chaos and the suffering, but yet create this special place where you're like, but we have this other way of being and seeing. And so a lot of your book is about navigating these, they can be painful, uncomfortable spaces, but also like finding a collectivity, finding a way to like be joyful and creative. And so
yeah, like alienation as maybe a starting point but not a destination. I think Punk's really offered me and that I'm hoping to offer in turn with the book. I think Benjamin's going to join us now again to help us navigate these wonderful questions that have accumulated.
Yeah, we have a couple. So I'm just going to go down the list. I'm going to ask, we have a musical either or question. So I'm just going to ask that one quickly. So Black Flag or Bad Brains?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can do without either one. Personally, that would be like picking between essential elements on the food pyramid. But I know that's a premise of the question. So obviously I'm gonna have to go Bad Brains.
Cool. Okay, thank you for answering. That was a challenging one and difficult to sort of narrow it down. So, okay, so we got that one out. So I'm gonna move on to this question. So the attendee asks, Sabrina brilliantly observes the punk quality of your writing. It's jovial and gallivanting, but also packs so much vigor into such a small space, like a minute 30 punk song. My question is, when you write, do you read your writing aloud to get a sense of the sonic quality?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a good one. Unfortunately, I don't do it as consistently as I would like to. Sometimes, like I think a section that Sabrina actually quoted from earlier, sometimes I'm like really zoomed in on the sonic quality of what I'm doing. And then other times it kind of slips out of the foreground. So I actually think in future writing, it'll be more of a point of emphasis than it was in this book.
Great. Thank you. Another sort of formal question. Could you talk a little bit about the form and the association of mixtape over, say, playlist? Those of us who have given someone a mixtape remember the connection and the camaraderie involved. And I was wondering if that is something you were looking to capture.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think I don't make as much of a distinction between mixtapes and playlists as some people do. But, obviously I have a little bit more experience with mixtapes and playlists. When I was coming up and sort of first being indoctrinated, if you will, with punk stuff, I benefited a lot from people who were sort of mixtape connoisseurs. I had a couple different English teachers who were like aware that I liked one band. Maybe I like wrote about Minor Threat or something. And they'd say, oh man, you're into this music. And then they'd come back with like several different burn CDs of like all their faves. And I think I feel really acutely aware that there's something intimate, personal, and uniquely edifying about someone taking the time to curate what is effectively an experience for you, right? Like, don't just listen to these things, but listen to them in this sequence. I think there's like particular rhetorical affordances that emerge from somebody saying, I want you to understand something, but I'm going to use this prop, a musical aid, to help you understand something about either me or how I look at the world or a feeling that I'm experiencing. And I have been fortunate to have those sorts of engagements with my friends where they'll say like, I'm having this, maybe I'm having trouble in my professional life, and this particular song by Lucinda Williams is something that I'm listening to help me cope. And here's this lyric that is particularly resonant with this thing that I'm going through. And I think I've had enough experiences like that where I'm like, yeah, the use of this musical aid has revealed things to me that I'm not sure I would get if you just kind of talk to me about it. And that happened enough where I was like, wait, that should maybe be like the backbone of a book. And maybe by using that as a backbone, I'll be able to capture some things that would be really hard to come by otherwise.
Great. So we actually have a couple questions that are sort of about like the curation of the book. So someone asked, what kinds of music do you gravitate towards now? Do you listen to punk as much as you did? And if you do, is it punk that you used to listen to, or are you kind of always discovering new punk music?
Oh, well, I have a catchphrase where I always say I'm a present tense punk. There's like a big time urge to be like someone who's like, oh yeah, that's something I did when I was younger. And that's cool, but it's just not where I'm at. So I'm like making a very deliberate effort to seek out new bands, but not just like bands that emerged in the last 5 years, but to also like listen to stuff from the 70s that I, for whatever reason, was never into. Like recently, you know, I've like gone back and like actually started to pay attention to the Buzzcocks, which is like a band that was always in the ether, but for whatever reason, they never made it into my diet. But that said, I'm not like a musical partisan, right? I like pop music a whole lot. I like R&B, listen to a lot of old soul records. Lately, I'm really paying a lot of attention to country blues. I've like had this resurgent interest in Mississippi John Hurt. So punk is something that's important to me in an ongoing way, but certainly not to the exclusion of other cool stuff.
And then I think this will be the question we have to end on, but just sort of juicy question. Was there anything that didn't make it into the final draft of the book that you wish was still there? Were there songs you wrote about or essays that you had that just didn't make the cut?
Yeah, I mean, so many things. This is a big cutting room floor book, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. Kill your darlings, I guess. The main thing that I kind of wish I could have found a way to incorporate is an essay comparing Green Day's Last of the American Girls with the video in which Brian Encenia beats the crap out of Sandra Bland, right? Where the song is sort of valorizing a kind of feminine disobedience and characterizing it as uniquely American. And then if you watch the Sandra Bland video, she's embodying exactly what Green Day is valorizing, except she's being punished for it. What does that mean? What does that cultural doublespeak tell us about how different norms and mores are applied inconsistently depending on who we're talking about? So I'll probably do something with that essay somewhere in the world, maybe eventually.
Here's hoping. Sounds amazing.
Thanks.
So that looks like all the questions we have time for. I just want to thank both of you once again for this fantastic conversation. It's been such a joy to witness it. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Boyz in the Void at harvard.com. It's on our website, as well as I put the link to purchase in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, please enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading and stay safe, everyone. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Benjamin. Everyone have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
See you later, Sabrina.
Bye.